Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks for tuning in again for another episode of interviews with colleagues. Um, I'm here today with Dr. Chris Conti, a good friend, good colleague, known a long time. We both work at Western Sydney Uni, and I'm pleased to invite him and happy that he's accepted to talk to me about his area of expertise, I believe. Beckett. Yes?
Alleged area of expertise.
Alleged. Um, and the piece that I read is God Bothering Beckett. I love the title. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that. And I'm obviously interested in learning a bit more about Beckett's in- engagement or forays into theology or not theology or negative theology or however you want to, talk about. And I know we're going to dive into this. Defining Beckett's approach is in itself a complex and interesting world, as I learned from reading your paper, which was really cool, by the way, really nicely written. I really enjoyed it. So thank you for sharing that with me.
You and three other people.
I'm sure there's more. Um, so, Chris, can I start by asking you, tell us a little bit about yourself in terms
Oh,
of
no, let's not
just
start there.
who are you,
We'll get
Chris?
away from that topic as quickly as
What
we
do you
can.
do at Western?
Let me just say thanks very much, Milad, for bringing us in. We've all got our terribly busy schedules, but you're probably the only person that could get me onto a podcast, I think. And I've listened to a few others, in fact, throughout this year and really enjoyed what you've been doing with some colleagues and having conversations. So I thought, yeah, okay, I'll do it for Milan. Won't do it for anyone else,
Thank
but
you.
do it for
It
Milan.
means a lot to me.
So yeah, look, I teach here alongside good colleagues like you at Western, have done for a number of years now. And I teach in literary studies and teach various courses on the core and electives and various things. Um, and I suppose somewhere along the line, uh, probably pretty early, in fact, I think we had a similar kind of intellectual
Yeah.
upbringing in the theory days, and we were more or less obliged, I think, to do readings beyond our particular sphere of expertise and a
Mm,
kind of compulsion to know a little bit more about what came to be called capital T theory.
yeah.
Very quickly, at any rate, I got interested in philosophy and literature.
Mm,
And I sometimes felt like I was drawn to certain kind of authors, often literary modernists,
mm,
who themselves were interested in philosophy or whose own work at least hedged on some long-standing kind of, what do I call them? Philosophical complaints, itches, concerns,
mhm.
worries, and
Yeah.
have themselves attracted philosophical attention, either from literary critics
Yes.
or, in fact, from philosophers. And Beckett was one of these characters who um, not only has his own quite idiosyncratic
Mm,
set of kind of philosophical concerns or attractions or worries and readings. He read a lot in philosophy, made all sorts of protestations about not being a philosopher, but in fact was very well read
mm,
in the history of philosophy um, and had his own peculiar interests. Like when Heidegger was all the rage, he was interested in Schopenhauer. He's also
mhm.
interested in this obscure Dutch Cartesian philosopher from the 17th century, Arnold Herlinx. And that has really puzzled people in a way because there's nothing very sexy or trendy about Arnold Herlinx's work. But what did Beckett find in it?
Mm,
Here's Beckett, who's often rated as one of the measures of kind of advanced kind of thinking and daring um, uh, modernist who puts a lot of questions on the line about the nature and point and purpose of existence. What on earth is someone like this found in this obscure Dutch Cartesian philosopher? So that obviously then drew my attention. But there's been philosophers like Cavell and Adorno in particular who were drawn to Beckett and compelled really to write about him and write about his work. So I found myself getting interested in writers like this, in writers like Beckett, particularly as a kind of challenge. So for me, it was a particular kind of challenge. It was like a bit of an Everest. It's like,
Mhm.
here's this difficult philosopher. The deeper you go into it, the more you find, and sometimes in some ways, the harder it is to get your head around, or at least to come up with a good, coherent response to.
Yeah.
You always feel like you haven't quite got him, that there's something about your own kind of explanatory responses that are kind of falling off the edges of Beckett, or are being absorbed by him, or
Mhm.
shrugged off, or just not quite capturing the challenge that he's putting out. And so I've found myself returning to
Right.
Beckett repeatedly as a kind of challenge, repeated challenge to make sense
Mm.
of his narrators, of his work. And it's that point, really, and this is probably the philosophical bit,
Mm.
of trying to make sense of Beckett, trying to make sense of things, trying to make sense of everything, of life, existence, etc., that he keeps putting before you, as I felt it,
Right.
as a reader. So you kind of get absorbed, stuck even. Um, at a certain point with Beckett. Having said that, I'm not. I don't feel like I'm completely there now. In that sort of headspace, I feel like I've had my say in some ways, or he's taken enough out of me that I haven't actually gone back and read much of Beckett in recent times. But
Okay.
I certainly know and appreciate what when people get absorbed by by an author like Beckett and just sit with him for years,
Yeah.
and think with him, through him, and just keep returning to him. That was a fairly long-winded
No, I love it.
answer.
I love it. And that's kind of what I was looking for. Because I think it's important that we sort of start in that space because your relationship to Beckett is kind of what defines the work that you do, how you read him, see him. So that gave me a lot. And I guess making sense, as you said, of things is an interesting perhaps point to start because as I was reading your paper and thinking about Beckett, and I confess I know very little about Beckett myself, it's th there is a kind of like a strangeness about that statement, about that phrase making sense, because it's kind of he defies in a way making sense, if I've got that right, because I'm reading through it, I'm going, when are we going to make sense of stuff?
That's right.
There's no
That's right.
making sense.
When do we get to the end of this?
Yeah. Um, and just kind of picking out like the way you kind of finish it too is interesting because you sort of finish with using the word hope. You bring in the word, and I just love that in a way. So there is this is how you put it. In fact, the mute appeal of hope.
Mm.
Again, very Beckettian. Um, so, but let me start. I guess is that a fair statement that this making sense seems like a paradox in the world of Beckett?
Yeah, we certainly hit lots of paradoxes very, very quickly um,
Mm,
in Beckett. And these are ones that we might talk about this later, how he actually implants in the structure of his work. So
right.
there's a structural point that actually provoke an aesthetic point, if you like, that actually provokes this particular kind of questioning. It's not like there are these things, there are these paradoxes outside his art. He actually creates certain kind of self-canceling syntactic and narrative structures that provoke these kind of questions with regard to sense and perhaps nonsense, or at least the difficulty of trying to make sense, the difficulty of trying to make sense of Beckett's work, and trying and failing and trying again, is a movement, if you like, that his narrator that mirrors his narrators,
Hmm.
and what his narrators doing. His narrators are themselves trying to make sense of their surroundings and keep coming up against their own ignorance or uncertainty or pain and struggle that they feel in
Yeah.
that process. So, in other words, we as readers are in a very similar position to Beckett's narrators.
Mm.
They claim to know, and Beckett himself said this about his own works, I don't know any more than my narrators do.
Mm.
So don't ask me to provide answers that I can't provide answers for. So he keeps throwing this back on to the reader to make sense. So just when you try to typecast him, maybe Beckett's a nihilist, or maybe he's a this, maybe it's a that, it actually comes back to you as a reader.
Okay.
And your attempts to make sense of Beckett end up sort of matching or mirroring a wider attempt that you might make in your own life to make sense of your own life. How are you making sense of your own life? How are you putting a point and purpose on your little narrative through
Mm.
life? And at what moments are your efforts kind of collapsing?
Mm-hmm.
And then at what moment, what do you do in those moments when they collapse in anxiety and stress and anger?
Mm.
How do you then pick yourself up and go on? Which is a
Mm.
famous sort of Beckettian
Okay.
kind of injunction, is to go on
Interesting.
despite everything,
Right, right, right.
despite your life falling apart, despite the despair, despite you go on. And this is the kind of particular phase of Beckett, but it's also an ongoing kind of narrative thematics, if I can put it like that,
Mm.
that ends up distilling a lot of this hope that despite
Mm.
the fact that you can't seem to make a wider sense of
Mm.
um, uh, this life, this
Yeah.
universe,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that you still go on. And how he actually gets to that a weird sense of kind of ethical fatalism is the way I put it in the article. I found fascinating. How does he doing this? How is he provoking this
Mm.
these questions in me?
Mm.
And how am I finding a peculiar, despite all of it, and despite the blackness of it, and the inverted commas despair of it, how am I finding a peculiar kind of solidarity, a peculiar kind of hope
Mm.
in this struggle, which is kind of unrelenting
Mm-hmm.
and doesn't give us any kind of certainty of answers.
Yeah. Now, I have so what I'm understanding is, I guess, you can correct me, is it sounds like making sense is kind of like a bait.
Is it what?
A bait. Uh, it's like baiting us in a way. Come on, let's see.
Yeah.
And so you kind of start the journey, and you really start the journey, and you start the journey in a way that is more genuine and sincere than maybe other thinkers lead on, other theoreticians lead on, or admit to. So in that sense, I really love the way Beckett does his work and how he draws us in and then brings us into a kind of a very crude reality that we exist in fact. Um, and so as I was reading the suffering and the struggle, everything that you just mentioned, obviously my corresponding understanding to this is medieval Sufi literature,
Yeah,
like for
right.
example, Attar. And I don't want to
No, please.
take over by,
No, please
but just
do.
to give you a point of reference for me, when I was reading through that and the narrators' voices, especially the God Bothering agent and the cursing of God and pushing back on the complaints. Um, that is all reminiscent for me of for one Sufi figure of the medieval period, which is by the name of Attar of Nishapur. And of course, Nishapur is a place that is ravaged and decimated by Mongols in the 12th century. And Nishapur is one of the places in the northeastern province of Iran that really gets hit the hardest. And so something like almost 98% of the population is wiped out. Um, and Attar is this kind of poet, mystical thinker who writes through his narrators, through his characters in his poems, who are set up to be fools. And the fool is the one who can get away with saying things to God, like complaining or cursing, calling God out for his mistakes and so on and so forth. So this kind of really uh, spoke to me in that sense because
Yeah,
well, at least I could relate to it that way.
totally.
But um, before we go any further, I feel like we immediately jumped into the deep end.
No, go for
I
it.
was
Yeah.
going to ask you, are you can you please give us a little bit of background to Beckett himself? Is
Yeah,
that is that is that
absolutely.
okay? Yeah.
So just
Who is he?
really, yeah,
For someone
just
who's hearing this for the first time.
yeah. He was an Irish writer and dramatist from the uh, he Protestant background, broadly Protestant background. He became as a young guy, he met James Joyce and was briefly Joyce's amanuensis. So he was actually, as a young man, got to know Joyce in Paris when he left Ireland, and learned a lot, I think, from Joyce. At the same time, he's beginning to write, trying to work himself out and work out whether I'm going to be an academic, am I going to be a writer, what sort of life I'm going to put together here. And he starts writing at this time, trying to write a novel, and trying to incorporate a lot of his reading. And for someone with the education that he had, there's a lot of stuff, even though he became quite skeptical, and perhaps even atheistic, or he also had a huge amount of biblical knowledge. His mother was quite a strong Christian. I think his father was probably Christian as well, Christian Protestant, but his mother, I think, was the real believer who he had a strong and quite difficult relationship with. At any rate, his head was full of Latin. He was very good at languages. He knew bits of Italian. He knew French inside out, knew bits of German. But the Latin's kind of interesting. It's kind of this dead, useless language in a way, but he was very good at it. And at one stage, he does find a use for it, and that is 10 years later, transcribing this Dutch Cartesian philosopher's work in the Trinity College, where he's actually discovered these things written in Latin. And he starts transcribing them, making sense of them, finding that he's got this weird sort of bond with this Dutch kind of Calvinist Cartesian thinker, Arnold Herlings, back in the 17th century. And the connections are kind of interesting. That there's a kind of philosophical thing going on, and done through theology. Of course, everyone keeps forgetting this, that theology is so tied up with philosophy. And when medieval thinkers like the Sufi guys you were mentioning are talking about theology and God, they're not just, they're not doing this naively. They're doing this with a huge tradition of thought behind them with regard to the nature of reality. And in many ways, the God they're talking about is a kind of metaphysical God, or an absolute, or there's a personal God as well, but there's this philosophical heritage that to do with what is the nature of the real that is going on in a lot of theological talk. So it's not just simple naive kind of fundamentalist belief that we're talking about. He was a great critic of that, Beckett, and loved taking the piss and having lots of satirical attacks at naive Christian belief and popular piety in Ireland. In fact, the popular piety in Ireland, he couldn't stand. And he found it, that sort of establishment religion, he was totally against. A kind of false piety, and as he found it, he made lots of jokes about how the pigs and dogs of Ireland will end up crossing themselves at a certain sort of time of day. It's so thoroughly was the country kind of drenched in a kind of established, kind of thoughtless, really, kind of religious outlook, but associated with a kind of repression, I suppose. Yeah. He hated that and he resented that very strongly, but he also had it deeply in him. And I think to really hate something and to really want to overcome it, it's got to be really deeply in you. Yeah. So he had a lot of biblical knowledge, and he knows the Bible really, really well, and he knows the poetry of the Bible really, really well, and he's constantly riffing off it, subverting it, playing games with it, never simply endorsing it at all, but it's all through his work, and it's one of the things that is often still, believe it or not, underappreciated, is just how well he knew the Bible and how well he uses it throughout his work. So he's an interesting figure for me for a number of reasons. And one is that kind of antagonistic relationship that he's got with his own, religious upbringing. Yeah. But that he uses the very tools that were kind of implanted in him, that he kind of resents in a way, but he uses those very tools to cut out this different kind of path, and as a kind of orientation in his own life, even if, let me put it this way, it doesn't work, right? This stuff doesn't really provide the answers. He's going to use them as part of his kind of philosophical and ethical kind of resources to try and make sense of things, even if the process of making sense is to keep hitting these impasses that don't make sense. And that some of the promises, if you like, of theology and established religion are repeatedly exposed. by Beckett as ridiculous, wrong, vain, silly, and lies. But then he'll still use, if you like, the moment his characters kind of cut off the head of God, as it were, he sprouts back again. So there's this. Here's how we get caught in various kind of paradoxes, and these sort of paradoxes are in the movement of his work. But they also have resonances, I suppose, that remind certain people of things like negative theology, um, uh, particular kind of traps that we're trapped in thinking about. Let's not even call it God. Let's just call it the nature of a kind of absolute reality, or the absolute, that our minds can't help but think and return back to trying to give an account of the absolute. That doesn't matter what you call it. Call it nothingness, call it God, call it whatever you like. It's our mind will keep coming back to points about wanting to know the nature, in an absolute sense, of the real. It's like it might even be a human frailty that we, our minds just can't help but do that at certain points, even if it doesn't help us. And even if we can't agree on the nature of the real, our mind will want to know that is there or is there not, at the basis of all the comings and goings and coming into beings and exiting again. The million deaths that happen every moment on this planet, the things coming into life and then going again, is at the bottom of that. Is there a core of permanence of some kind, or is there not? And if there is, what does it look like? And if there is it so close to nothingness that there's no difference? And so these are things that kind of mysteries that Beckett ends up exploring through narrators that confess repeatedly that they simply don't know. They do not know, and they get puzzled and fraught and mystified by sometimes really basic questions to do with simple particulars that they're faced with in their lives. So at any moment, his narrators can plunge into a kind of epistemological crisis. That brings up these wider kind of philosophical questions. That sounded terribly vague. I do apologize.
No, that's fine. That was great. Sorry, you may have mentioned this and I'm so absorbed and I missed it. Time period?
Oh, sorry. It wasn't a very good explanation of Beckett, was it? So yeah, time period was, so basically he dies in the late 80s.
Okay.
Maybe it's 1989. He's sometimes called the last modernist. So his writing is, he writes a novel, I think his first novel is about 1934, I think. Or maybe it's a bit later. He hasn't quite sorted himself out till the war. The war becomes a big kind of key moment for him. He is in Ireland, famously leaves Ireland for France. He'd lived there, had what will be his wife there, and he immediately goes back, and there's jokes that he makes about wartime France being far more interesting than peacetime Ireland. And so he leaves right into the storm and goes back to Paris right as the Nazis are entering Paris. Goes back to his apartment and then goes on this kind of pilgrimage to this Roussillon in the south of France, where he will spend the rest of the war in, not great circumstances, often sort of wondering where food's going to come from the next day. And a lot of that period will reappear in the kind of devastated, spare landscapes of Waiting for Godot or any other number of plays that will follow after the war. So by 1944, he writes a novel called What? A very mysterious, strange novel, which he says at the time he writes almost for personal therapeutic reasons, to keep his head together. And it's a very mysterious novel, in some ways the most philosophical of his novels, with regard to this narrator who's just cannot make sense of his experience in Mr. Nott's house. And this becomes a kind of allegory, I suppose, of trying to make sense of the bare particulars of our lives as we try to put a pattern on them that might make sense of them as a whole. And that there again is a kind of philosophical or theological gesture right there. Do our lives amount to something? Or are they just one damn thing after another? Because the one damn thing after another thing, it keeps coming back to us. There are just these bare facts and particulars that we keep getting reminded of, and our ideas about how they might be grouped together to create a larger meaning are constantly being exposed as illusions, as kind of wishful thinking, as any number of things. They keep shattering against the kind of the bare facts or the bare particulars of life. We keep rebuilding them and keep restructuring, but and Beckett keeps coming back to those moments. And so his characters, in this sense, are they're already very knowing characters that have undergone lots of disillusionment and are always making jokes about their own, almost in a self-protective way, about their own hopes for a wider point and purpose and meaning, which is constantly being undercut. And so they keep having to go forward again and have to get used to the fact that they're not going to have final answers, that they're not going to have a nice, complete answer, that they're going to have to remain in a certain kind of ignorance about their life, about the reality that surrounds them, and they're going to have to go on. And that their pains and struggles in the end might be meaningless. And he'll make jokes about that whole process in a way that creates this curious kind of strength. A kind of when you are totally sort of disillusioned and yet you find a way to go forward, you actually get better and better at accommodating yourself to the disappointments of reality, the incompletion of things, the contingency of our lives, of our values. And you do so in a way that teaches you to overcome anxiety. And you learn to live with the pain of this. And pain becomes a really important sort of constant in all of Beckett's narrators. And once again, this is a quasi-theological point, because theology will do a lot with ideas of suffering and pain. And Beckett will undercut some of those theological discourses, because theological discourses of various kinds will be trying to make sense of the pain and the suffering, in many ways trying to cash it out, that it will be, in a simple theology, it'll be cashed out in the idea that, we'll all go to heaven and things will be fine. And that there'll be a point to your suffering. Well, Beckett will just continually mock that idea as itself perhaps even an offensive idea, that there is a larger point or justification of all our sufferings can lead you to offer, or to turn your back on a lot of suffering, and to just think, oh, well, it'll make sense in the end. There will be a larger narrative, a larger religious narrative that will make sense of this. It's God's point and purpose. So you can imagine this came up in Adorno's point. He was horrified by attempts to justify Auschwitz, for example, or any kind of man-made mass suffering. It's like, no, this is barbaric, it's horrible, it's brutal, and let's stop pretending that there's a larger point and purpose to this. There's no point and purpose to this. It's awful. And this is partly what's so awful about it. It's meaningless suffering. And there isn't, we have to get used to the idea that there isn't a larger theological justification for this. And that's as hard as it gets with regard to facing that sort of stuff down and still moving on and still finding a way to move on in face of that kind of lack of consolation. It is a kind of mental pain, and there is a kind of mental anguish that Beckett's narrators have. They keep coming back to suffering, and perhaps pointless suffering, that there is no wider, larger justification. So here's this anti-theological moment in Beckett, if you like, but of course it brings in theology. Precisely the attacks on theology that are done repeatedly throughout Beckett, and Beckett knows this, are going to bring in theological discourses of eschatology, of theodicy, of these larger kind of inherited structures that are expressed differently in modernity, in secular modernity, often in hidden ways. We don't use the term theodicy and eschatology, but we have kind of debased theodicies and eschatology in a lot of secular progressive thinking. We just don't realize that we've inherited certain or fragments of certain theological discourses in our account of things. And of course, yeah, I better stop there.
No, no, that's fine. It's given me a lot of sort of prompts for responding because I'm thinking about one book that I read a while ago by a German Iranian author by the name of Navid Kermani. And Kermani is, I think, is quite an intelligent person. He writes contemporary stuff. Works on different projects, but one book that he wrote, and I was kind of interested at the time because I was doing some work on Atta, is it's called The Terror of God.
That could be
Now,
a useful title for an article about Beckett, actually.
the subtitle, interestingly, was Job, just from memory, Job and the revolt against God, something along these lines.
Yeah.
Job, Attar, and the revolt against God, because obviously, as I said, in Attar's work and poetry, you have um, these kind of agents of disputation who sort of protest against God and call out all the injustices. Um, and these fools, these kind of, because they get a free pass, because they're idiots, they're fools, right? They don't know any better. And Attar plays this game very well. And of course, Job, as we know, the story of Job in the Bible is all about human suffering. It's one particular person who loses everything on the gamble. Now, depending on how you read this text and who does the interpretation and the hermeneutics here, but essentially it's he becomes the subject of a gamble between God and the devil. Devil's kind of
It's a
like,
horrifying idea when you think about it, isn't it?
see what I can do to turn this guy against you. And
Yeah.
God's like, all right, give it a go. But he's a good guy, he's not going to fold. He's like, all right, let me have a go.
Yeah.
And so these horrible, horrible things happen to this man, and he stays silent all the way through, right until the end. And then, of course, he protests and he starts to complain about God and about his lot and everything. And so, but then he's humbled, and then he regains everything. Spoiler warning: if you haven't read Job, you should have read Job if you haven't. Not you, Chris. I'm pointing to the
Yes, yes.
mic. Um, so, and then there's this kind of theodicy narrative in a sense. This is the subject of Kermani's book, Theodicy, essentially,
Yeah.
because he brings in Satan as well in the Islamic tradition and the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition. He talks about all this stuff very deeply. And Attar is also inherits this kind of idea of a flipped Satan, where Satan is actually in the Sufi tradition, in a particular strand of Sufi tradition, a protagonist. He's not really the bad guy.
Yeah.
Um, and he's really the true monotheist. He's really the true faithful to God. Whereas he's saying that to God, he's saying to God essentially that human beings, Adam, your favorite creation, is really the one who's let you down, who's
Right.
got everything wrong.
Yeah.
Look, he doesn't even remember you.
Yeah.
I'm the one who's worshiping
That's
you
right.
all the time.
That's right.
So there's this
You're driving me
fascinating,
nuts about it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
fascinating correlations. And I was just thinking as you were speaking about everything that you're saying about Beckett, reminds me of this book that I read by Kermani. Brilliant book. Really thought-provoking
What
stuff.
century was that?
He's contemporary.
Oh, it's contemporary. Great.
Kermani is a contemporary author. Yeah,
Great.
yeah, yeah. Based in Germany.
We'll have to have a
And
look.
he's independent. He's just author. He just writes amazing books in German and English. Um, his books in German and then translated into English. Sorry,
Right.
I should have said. But essentially, there's this whole idea, like, so what I'm trying to say is kind of, in a sense, to try and understand Beckett better. I know from my own research and reading that there's a lot of raw literature. There's a lot of raw approaches within religion, within mystical movements such as Sufism, as I mentioned, um, in religious traditions that have going, like you said, I mean, Beckett is critical of false piety, popular religion, um, naive Christian belief.
He couldn't stand
And
it.
you can apply that to any tradition. Doesn't have to be Christian. And that that's a huge problem. So for me, I mean, you and I both, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, to some extent Heidegger, but Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, for example, you can easily, find this theme again where there's this electrifying thinking that battles against all these um, almost ridiculous ideas. Like, what are we doing? You know, accepting these things that are
Mm.
just almost insulting,
Yeah.
right, to our intelligence.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, we know better, and there's a deeper aspect to this reality, however you want to talk about it, that we really should be digging into
Mm.
and facing, confronting. And in a way, it begins by confronting ourselves for the
Mm.
first time.
Yeah.
For some of us, right? Right?
Absolutely.
Um, and also, I think you know very well, and this kind of came up a little bit in the book, in the paper. There's a Buddhistic, almost a sort of this nothingness, this
Mm.
talk of nothingness. I mean, impermanence is a Buddhist idea.
Mm.
Nothingness is a Buddhist idea. There is no permanence. There is no self. There is no absolute total thing. In a way, it's this conglomeration of aggregates or construction of ideas, that concepts, notions, perceptions that fall apart ultimately, especially in the face of um, reaching a state of enlightenment or nirvana, or whatever it is kind of like it's a almost dystopian in a sense, Buddhism. It's like you reach that point and the light comes on, but when what you see is nothing.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of anticlimax in a way, because enlightenment is really that you realize, yeah.
So, yeah, 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 yeah.
But I mean, there's a mystery about nirvana, obviously, so I don't want to sort of deflate Buddhism totally, in the sense that saying it's about nothing, but it's that nothingness is a mystery in itself, and
Mm.
nirvana itself is a
Mm.
mystery. But that aside, there's a kind of realism that's attached to Buddhism. There's a realism also that's attached to negative theology in Eastern Christian tradition. There is a realism that is found in Sufi mystical poetry, literature, like Atta, for example, um, who's one of my favorites. And so this is kind of where I feel like Beckett's bringing necessarily and importantly bringing to our attention in the 20th century some of these realities that, especially in a place like Ireland, and I've haven't read a lot on Ireland. It's not my area or anything, but I know enough about sort of cultural background and general history about Ireland that it's an incredibly religious place.
Mm.
And it doesn't matter whether you're Catholic or Protestant, it's it's full on.
Yes.
Saturates the place.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's actually well, make a quick apology here for it being a weakness in something
no,
I've done as well with regard to, and there's been a recent move, some very, very good Irish scholars
right.
who have actually gone back and said, okay, we've been kind of universalizing Beckett a bit too much here.
Mm,
We need to go back and look at the Catholic and Protestant Irish context, and not just that, but just the cultural Irish context of a lot of these Beckettian ideas, which Beckett himself kind of erases a little bit from his work, and he has this universalizing appeal.
mm,
But so there's been lots of really good scholarship on that, trying to get back to Catholic Ireland. But just picking up on a few of the other things that you said with regard to that universalizing appeal,
mm,
is that, yeah, you can bring this really interesting Sufi context to Beckett's work, which I think is totally valid. Without Beckett, as far as I know, too,
mm.
I don't think he knew anything about the Sufi poets or Islamic mysticism, but he would have known similar sort of currents
Yeah.
that well, I'm guessing Islamic thinkers, poets that you're talking about drew on. And one of them, one mystic that he would have, we know he read, was of course Eckhart.
Yeah.
So he knew
Yes.
Eckhart, and uh, again, this is people get very cagey in Beckett's scholarship about the camps. You know, are you trying to peg Beckett as a this or
Mm.
that? But I'm totally uninterested in any of that. I'm actually interested in trying to explain that agnotology, that I know nothing, that
Yeah.
sense of not knowing that
Yeah.
is all through Beckett's work.
Yeah.
And it has these negative theological kind of connotations. This doesn't mean I'm trying to say Beckett's a negative theologian or anything like that.
No.
It's more that these suggestions, I think, are points of entry onto Beckett's work. And so someone like you who can have this
Mm.
thorough scholarly background in Sufi mysticism can immediately find points of contact with reading Beckett's work, and
Mm.
it can become a really useful entry point. And people have done this. People who've read a bit of Zen Buddhism or whatever have
Mm.
then found interesting angles onto Beckett, even though, as far as we know, Beckett wasn't,
No.
widely read in this sort of stuff at all.
Mm.
But these are kind of interesting
Mm.
entry points. And just to quickly go back as well to the Job story. So the Job story,
Yeah.
which is a kind of ur-text of theodicy. This term theodicy as
Yes.
well is actually a modern term that really starts really with Leibniz, but it obviously has all these precursors. So even though the term only really appears, I think, with Leibniz and his response to Pierre Bayle's skepticism, and he writes that book, Theodicy, that's where the term sort of first kind of appears. But we know that there are all these precursor kind of ideas, and the ultimate ur-text, if you like,
Mm.
of theodicy is the Book of Job. And
Yeah.
sure enough, Beckett was thoroughly read
Mm.
in this book, and he makes jokes from very early on about,
Mhm.
I think it's Shoab the Abderite. I'm not sure, but there's one of these characters in that story who's one of Job's inverted commas friends,
Mhm.
who is sort of telling Job that, yeah, well,
That's
you're
right.
copying all this nonsense because you did this wrong and you did that wrong and
That
whatever.
right. Yeah.
And he makes jokes about the show of the Abderite. And he's constantly making these kind of theological jokes or jokes from
Yes.
theological scenarios in the Bible. And this one he comes back to in different ways as well. This story, I think it's behind a lot of his kind of investigation, his willingness to entertain
Mhm.
and return to scenarios that all of this might be meaningless, that suffering itself, we want it to have meaning,
Mm.
but maybe it isn't. Maybe it's meaningless, and maybe there's just pain. And he wants us to confront that bleakness, I think,
Mhm. Yeah.
and yet come out of that, if you like, or
Yeah.
at least just cope with that. And so it's in the background of a lot of his work and a lot of his ideas about pain and anguish. Not only is the suffering meaning, or our attempts to give it meaning can collapse into nothing and therefore a kind of meaninglessness, but not knowing why we're suffering, but it itself becomes another bit of mental anguish
Mm.
and another little bit of why is this happening to me? This is probably a Job moment too at some point, isn't it? Why me?
Mm.
Why is this happening to me? And this is something, of course, that happens to anyone. You undergo suffering, a friend, a loved one dies, a massive setback happens to you, and you get smashed by life,
Mm.
basically, and you can't help but think, why me? But that will never really have an adequate answer because there may be no why.
Yeah.
There's no why.
Mm.
You've just been smashed by life.
Mm.
And again, this is a source of a lot of jokes in
Mm.
Beckett. It's like, cop that. There's another one coming. And he'll kind of produce a kind of funny, kind of humorous solidarity out of this.
Yeah.
But he wants us to just accommodate ourselves to that reality,
Mm.
which involves coping with the fact that our big answers aren't enough.
Mm.
We keep coming back to them and we keep having to rebuild them, but our lives can be smashed. Or that story, particularly in ultimate redemptive sort of terms, can be smashed
Mm.
at any moment. And we're left with the gap between that large meta narrative about, yes, there's a point and purpose to it all, and no, there isn't. There was no reason why my close friend here had to die. None. And that pain, and Beckett won't let us forget that the pain
Mm.
of those particular moments. And incidentally, with regard to the theodicy question, there's um, in many ways, he will draw a kind of anti-theodicy, a kind of modern theodicy, if you like,
Mm.
uh, out of that kind of Job story. So, in other words, creation's been botched, right? Maybe there is a kind of devil figure behind it, a demiurgic
Mm.
character who's behind the botched nature of reality.
Mm.
And in fact, there's a Polish thinker, Leszek Kolakowski, who actually revisits the Job story in this skeptical, jokey sort of way that is quite in the Beckettian sort of spirit. I write about this in another article. I've forgotten exactly how the story goes now, but it starts with the ultimate point of this little parable of revisiting the Job story in this context. This awful kind of test between a devil and a God figure, with Job as the subject being forced to suffer. Let's test his sort of
Resolve.
his
Yeah.
resolve, his fortitude. Let's see how it goes. Is that we end up drawing a funny kind of minimalist, pared back
Right.
theodicy from the very botched nature of creation, if I can put it that way.
Okay.
So we learn, in other words, not to just fall into despair at the badness of the bad and how bad things can be. And in many ways, that's the going on bit. It's about all our meta narratives, all our big stories that have been passed down that are kind of stuffed with meaning in many ways. They all collapse. They don't work. Now you either collapse yourself at that moment into the blackness of despair, or somehow you find a way of extracting from that mess something that enables you to go on. And Beckett will keep coming to the going on. Don't worry, you don't understand, but just go on. And in fact, you've got nothing else to do but just go on. It doesn't make sense, but
Just go on.
Go on.
Yeah.
You're getting used to it now. And then there's that movement that is like a cycle that keeps going on. And there's the big meanings of all our large cultural meta narratives have smashed. They've been broken. All our eschatologies or our theodicies, they've been smashed, they've been broken by reality, but somehow in all those ruins, in that mess, he will extract, or his narrators will extract, a curious, self-mocking, very, very funny sense, or enough to just very little, almost nothing is the phrase in one of his works that will pull you back from despair. Because that's another question in Beckett's. Why it's getting kind of black here, and it's getting kind of nihilistic. Why don't his characters just neck themselves? And they don't. There's a funny kind of sense in which suicide's almost impossible in Beckett's universe. They joke about it all the time, though.
Yes.
They're constantly making jokes about suicide, but it's almost like that's too easy, or it's like that's not actually going to solve anything. Because what might happen after that? You don't know. It might actually be worse after killing yourself. You might end up in some weird purgatorial zone that is where you constantly have to relive that horrible sort of moment of suicide. So suicide doesn't have any answers. Everywhere you look for a certainty in Beckett, even those anti or skeptical certainties, they don't exist either. So there's no refuge in skepticism, right? And there's sometimes I think it can look like there is, but there's no refuge there either because there's no certainties in skepticism. Skepticism, as much as metaphysics, is just another crutch that we are using in the face of uncertainty, or at least a certain type of sort of skepticism. I mean, ultimately, we would call him a kind of skeptic, but he's a skeptic that is not going to fall for the idea that you can kind of find a new certainty in your lack of knowledge, because there'll still be no certainties. You still keep coming back to uncertainty, contingency, and having to cope with that. That experience, mental and kind of actual of uncertainty, of contingency, and how we have to deal with that is what he keeps putting our faces in, moment after moment after moment in his work.
I think that's great. I think that's a very key part of Beckett.
By the way, he would have loved this stuff on the Sufi mystics. He would, I think, some of what you've said about it, I think, would interest him straight away, and he'd want to go back because he was an omnivorous reader. He would have gone back and read
Beckett's listening right now.
He would somewhere he's listening.
He would love the title of Attar's book. the Book of Afflictions.
The Book of Afflictions, yeah. Yeah.
So, in Persian, it's called Musibat Name. Name is like a book or a letter or an essay, but it's Book of Afflictions or Book of Suffering. Sometimes it's been translated. But afflictions, and the entire story is this wayfarer who's seeking understanding. Mhm. Why? And he's guided by his Sufi master to go and visit all manner of creatures, gods, creatures, angels. So he talks to angels, elements, prophets, like rock, water, air, sky, mountains, each of them asking them, what is God? What is the point of it all? What's the meaning of all this suffering? And each of them naturally, in a humorous way, deliciously written, complain.
Right.
Because he praises them, each one.
Mm.
Oh, you glorious mountain, prize of God's creation, blah, blah, etc., etc. It's like, what are you talking about? I'm standing here suffering all the time, wind being blown on my face, snow falling on, so on and so forth. You get all these nice imagery. But, same, every stage, everyone he talks to. Um, and really the story ends in a way that is not satisfying, if you
Mm.
like.
Mm.
'Cause there's no answer. Atta doesn't really give an answer. And so I love this book. It's one of my favorites of Atta's. It's probably it's very mystical, but at the same time, it's probably his most candid, his most sort of not depressing, but like I
Yeah.
don't know, I can't find another word. The most like well, it just kind of leaves it hanging
It's funny you mentioned
and leaves you hanging.
the wayfarer you're talking about as well.
Yeah,
That is there's a kind of metaphorics, if I can call that,
yeah, yeah,
of both of the way,
yeah.
which is of course the Christian sort
That's
of
right.
cross and the
I
way.
remember that. Yeah,
Very strong Christian discourse. Beckett will play with that,
yeah.
undercut it, break it apart,
Mm,
but still use it.
mm,
Um, Even though we have, like a section of a path, we don't know which way to go, whether this way or that way, we're stuck with, Mercier and Camille. What do we do now? And there'll be discussion about what we do. And in the end, they throw up their hands and just sort of just keep
keep
going.
going.
Uh, but that whole kind of quite strong, again, kind of Christian metaphorics of the way, uh, is used, undercut, as I said, deconstructed, reworked, and it's all through Beckett. You can see it in Godot, you can see it in any number
Mm,
um, of his plays, and he just keeps returning to it, and it keeps returning us to the uncertainty of the moment, and yeah, the pain of wanting to know.
mm,
Well, where are we going to find a bed tonight? And are we going to be able to sleep tonight? Are we going to have a bit of
mm,
what promise have we got here that we can just get a bit of a rest from some of the torments we've got? And in the end, it's the conversation, the whinging, the jokes, the moment that is shared with another character in a lot of his work,
mm.
like Waiting for Godot and Mercy and Camille. That's the moment of consolation right there. There's a little bit of solidarity right there, in the whinging, in the jokes, in the sharing
Mm.
of that little burden of not knowing. That's about as most consolation as you'll get in
Okay.
Beckett, because you get a lot of other characters that are just alone with themselves in the dark, muttering in the dark, trying to find consolation
Wow.
on their own. But then you have these interactions with kind of voices in the head. There's this haunting sort of space that Beckett's work will end up entering. But yeah, that movement you spoke about, asking the mountain, asking the wind,
Mm.
and then just like, well, I don't know, God, do you know what it's like to be me? That becomes this humorous,
Yeah.
funny, but funny wise
Mm.
kind of dialogue or journey. And again, it's that journey,
Mm.
that uncertainty that Beckett, particularly in his middle period,
Yeah, yeah.
is all his work is kind of centered there.
So I want to sort of um, get into this a little bit more with you because I mean I'm a religious studies scholar, so for me, obviously the peak of interest is the theology and the religious aspects of this. Um, and you mentioned that there's no classifying, categorizing, pigeonholing Beckett, and I love that, and it reminds me of another poet from the 14th century by the name of Hafez, which we won't go into, who's also similar. You just cannot. With Attar, you can say he's a mystic,
Mm.
Sufi. With Hafez, you can't even say he's a Sufi or a mystic.
Mm.
It's just he's got this kind of undeniability of everything written all over him. So
Yeah.
I get the sense for Beckett. I kind of I feel that, and I do not want to do that, and that's not my goal or intention. And I realize the impossibility of even understanding Beckett, and I think that's the goal. There is no understanding. There's no making sense. There's just the thing. Let's go on. So we're going to, in the spirit of Beckett, we're going to go on. um, but I want to ask you, like, because you said the religion stuff is really deep within him, um, but he's also wanting to critique quite heavily, and he can.
Mm.
Um,
Got to have culture in you if you're going to reject it and get overcome it, sort of thing. Yeah,
yeah,
in this case, religion.
so
Yeah.
taking it out or denying it or critiquing it or attacking it or undermining it also, as you said, brings it in. So this is
Mm-hmm.
an opening for religion to come in,
Mm.
theology to come in and to remain and sort of be a part of his thing. Otherwise, I mean, he could have just as easily written about something else.
Well, yeah, he could have just been, and there's
Not
certain
critiqued.
types of
Yeah.
contemporary atheism, for example, that are just kind of like, well, it's all nonsense, and
Yeah,
why get so worried about it?
that's right.
And that kind of
So that
is a kind of shoulder shrugging type atheism that wonders what it's all about. To me, there's not enough um, kind of cultural religion in someone that can so easily shrug
yeah.
it off. Um, but with regard to Beckett and um, mysticism,
Mm.
was this sorry, let me relocate myself with I don't want to miss what you were saying. You were talking about Beckett